is, of course, our former director, Daniel Weinstock of 7 years, and a longtime associate member who's been really involved in many of our programs, Ian Gould. The talk today is going to be moderated by Jay Shaw, also an associate member. And I've understood from Daniel that actually there's a working group or course that's been investigating and exploring some of these issues around cities and psychosis this term. So many of you clearly have an interest in this topic, and I'm really glad that we can shine some light on it. Thanks to Anaik and Jen and Sonia for advertising. And just as a reminder, this session is being recorded. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. So it's great to see a pretty decent group of folks joining, given that, this is a difficult time for everybody. But we know from a number of interactions over the last little while that this is a topic that's of great interest to a number of people. So it's a real pleasure to be able to both kind of moderate it as well as to introduce both of our speakers today and to be part of the IHSP seminar series. So we have two fabulous speakers. We're all very lucky. The first will be Ian Gould. So Ian is a professor of psychiatry and of philosophy at McGill University. Ian's focused on the study of delusions, sort of social neuroscience and reductionism in psychiatry and neuroscience. He's also been sort of one of a few figures, I think, internationally who's really put some of the emphasis on pulling together strands of both the science as well as the social sciences, so the natural sciences or health sciences, social sciences, to really synthesize how we might think about the role that cities play in the risk, onset, and course of psychotic illness, and pull together a really interdisciplinary group of people to continue that conversation. It's been very fruitful in a number of ways. So it's great to have Ian, and I'll introduce Daniel once Ian's given his talk, and then there'll be some time for questions afterward. Ian, do you want to take it away?
Thank you very much, Jay. Let me share my screen with you because I'll show you some slides. So my job in the webinar is to give you a bit of an overview of what it is we're talking about, to sort of set the table of the problem. And what Daniel will do is offer some more constructive thoughts about how we might tackle the problem. So let me begin just by saying a few words about the disorder, the illness that we're actually talking about. What is psychosis? The first thing to say is that most of you, all of you no doubt, will have heard of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a particular illness or psychiatric disorder. Psychosis is a family of disorders or a family of illnesses. So while someone might get diagnosed as suffering from psychosis, that's not itself, as it were, a proper diagnosis. Anything that is characterized by what are usually called positive symptoms, namely delusions and hallucinations, counts, well, one of the two, in fact, counts as a psychotic disorder. And it could be very, very brief. It could be, you could have psychotic symptoms associated with the delirium that might only last a very brief time. There are very brief disorders that can last as little as a few days that are psychotic disorders. Schizophrenia is different from all of those, primarily, not least anyway, in being a chronic disease or disorder. It begins typically in late adolescence, early adulthood, and it lasts for decades. And it's characterized by delusions, typically hallucinations, and what's called thought disorder, which is a disconnection or fragmentation of thought, usually obviously expressed in actual speech. It's also characterized by what are called negative symptoms, so absences rather than florid presences, blunted affects, or a lack of emotional expression, poverty of thought and speech, and avolition, a sort of inability to initiate action. And even though the positive symptoms are the ones that we typically think about when we think of schizophrenia, it's actually the negative symptoms that are typically more problematic from the point of view of the daily functioning of the person, and also from the point of view of treatment. So the drugs that are given to treat schizophrenia are actually much more effective at diminishing the positive symptoms than the negative ones. Now, Okay. Psychosis is unfortunately quite common. Different estimates give different numbers in different places, but a very rough estimate of 1 in 100 over a lifetime is about right, which means 1 in 100 people will in their lifetime suffer from schizophrenia. If you think of psychosis as a family and ask how many people will get that, the number increases quite dramatically. But of course, as I said, lots of other forms of psychotic disorders are brief, treatable, and so on. What causes schizophrenia or psychosis? There's a range of things. These are risk factors associated with schizophrenia in particular. Problems during pregnancy raises the risk that the baby will be diagnosed a winter birth for reasons that are mysterious, an older father also for reasons that are mysterious, though you can imagine some possibilities, and drugs of abuse, especially cannabis and meth, are all associated with raising one's risk of developing a psychotic disorder in later life. Now, as you know, there's been a huge amount of biological work trying to better understand schizophrenia, both work looking for genes associated with schizophrenia, and also lots and lots of work in neuroscience trying to understand what, as it were, a psychotic brain looks like. And although we've learned a huge amount about both schizophrenia and the brain, I think it's fair to say that the promise of the neurobiological and genetic revolutions haven't been fully realized in the context of schizophrenia. We still don't have genes where we can say these genes really are associated with schizophrenia. We still don't really understand what's wrong with the brain of somebody who has schizophrenia. And I'll say, just as an aside, some of you may have heard of what's called the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia. Dopamine, as you know, is a neurotransmitter, chemical in the brain, and it was thought by some people for some time that dopamine, an increase in dopamine in certain parts of the brain, was the cause of schizophrenia. And the dopamine, so-called dopamine hypothesis, was often represented as one of the great achievements of 20th century psychiatry. In fact, the people who were associated with the dopamine hypothesis never believed it, and there really wasn't ever a strong evidence for it, and it's not true. It's not to say that dopamine isn't part of the story of schizophrenia, but it's not an explanation, as it were, of schizophrenia. Okay, now, despite, as I said, the sort of somewhat unfulfilled promise of the biomedical model of schizophrenia, and somewhat paradoxically, I think, given the orientation of psychiatry, we actually know quite a lot about some other risk factors. And these risk factors are usually called the social determinants of schizophrenia. And there are, broadly speaking, 3 of them. One is adverse experiences, primarily in childhood, but adverse experiences later on can also raise the risk of psychosis. And there's a whole range of such experiences: death of a parent, sexual abuse, even bullying has been shown to raise the risk of psychosis. A second risk factor is immigration. Being an immigrant, and remarkably, being the child of an immigrant, raises your risk of psychosis, and actually raises it quite dramatically. So being an immigrant probably doubles your risk of schizophrenia. So instead of 1 in 100, it goes to 2 in 100. And that's comparable to the increase of risk that we see from, say, abusing cannabis. So it's pretty substantial change, even though in absolute terms, it's not a huge difference. The third risk factor is city living, the urban environment. And that's the subject of this webinar. I'll skip that. We've known that there's something toxic about cities when it comes to psychosis since 1939. Seems like quite a long time, given the history of psychiatry. 2 American sociologists, Robert Ferris and Warren Dunham, did a study of the distribution of psychotic illness in Chicago. And they found that in inner city neighborhoods that were characterized by sort of social disorganization and some isolation, there were higher rates of psychosis, higher rates of schizophrenia than there were of, say, bipolar disorder also a very severe psychological illness. And I'll just skip ahead. Here's a figure from the original study. And you can see on the left a sort of characteristic horseshoe sort of pattern of inner city neighborhoods. And the darker regions are regions where psychosis or schizophrenia was more prevalent. On the right-hand side, you see the same map for bipolar disorder, what was then called manic depression. Now, in the years since this original study, it's been shown that the city is definitely a risk factor for psychosis, both being born in a city, being brought up in a city, say till age 15, and even the city that you're currently living in are all associated with a changing risk of psychosis. And, oops, go back for a sec. And in fact, until quite recently, I'd say until the last 5 years or so, the received wisdom was that this was certainly a robust effect, absolutely no question about it. And moreover, that both population in cities and population density were the factors that were raising one's risk. And the risk seemed to increase in a more or less linear fashion, which is to say, if you grow up or you're born or grow up in, say, London, England, as opposed to London, Ontario, your risk of developing schizophrenia, all things being equal, is again about doubled. Quite a big effect. I'm going to say a bit more about that in a minute because in the last few years, our pictures changed somewhat. Before I move on to that though, let me just point out a lovely study from a few years ago showing for the first time that city living actually changes your brain. The pictures are not terribly informative, but what they show on the left is that under particular kinds of stress, the brain activity that you show correlates with the size of the city that you're currently living in. And what the image on the right shows is that under the same conditions of stress, the brain activity that you demonstrate seems to be correlated with the size of the city that you grew up in. So there's no doubt that there's some interaction between city size and brain activity, which of course has to be a prerequisite for whatever brain dysfunction eventually leads to schizophrenia. Okay, so let me just summarize for a minute by saying until about 5 years ago or so, this was the picture, that there's something about cities that is particularly toxic when it comes to psychosis, that city size in absolute terms and also city density, population density, seem to be the factors of importance. And as we sort of knew a priori, but now know empirically, city size does actually get under the skin, changes your brain in some way or other that presumably downstream will lead to psychosis. Okay, now, in the last, in the last few years, the picture's changed somewhat. And it's changed largely because the data has become much more refined and nuanced. We're sort of cranking up the resolution of our microscope. And as we do so, we're discovering that things are a little bit more complicated. First, very interesting complication comes from data in low and middle income countries. So all of the research that has been done in cities has been done in, well, primarily anyhow, in first world countries, especially in European countries. And when we turn to low and middle income countries, we find that this idea that city living raises your risk of psychosis just isn't true. So the numbers in the red square reflect your risk. The number 1 means that you have no more risk living in a city than not living in a city. A number higher than 1 means a greater risk of city living than non-city living. And a lower number means your risk is actually lower living in a city than non-city when it comes to schizophrenia. And you see, if you look at the numbers in both those little boxes, you'll see they're all over the place. And if you add them all up and you take the average is about 0. And what that means is that on average, the effect of city living on psychosis seems to hold only for first world countries. Remarkable finding, and we don't yet know what to make of it. The next bit of refinement comes from a huge study that was done between 2010 and 2015 in Europe. That is the largest, most rigorous study ever done. And what this study did is also showed us that as you get more refined data, the picture gets a bit more complicated. So in the north of Europe, you see the city effect, which is to say, as cities get bigger, the risk of psychosis grows. But in the south, you don't see that effect. The south seems to be more like some parts of the lower and middle income country category. And the picture becomes even more complicated because different aspects, different features of city living have begun to emerge in the literature as differentially associated with city risk when it comes to psychosis. So on the left-hand side, you see a whole range of factors that have some connection to cities. In other words, being in a city is associated with all of these factors. And those factors, when you separate them out, seem to be independently associated with the risk of psychosis. On the other hand, cities also bring along some benefits, not least of which is greater access to healthcare, and surprisingly, green space, or at least parts of cities that provide green space seem to have beneficial effects. So the picture we have now is really a bit of a mess in the following sense. We used to think that cities were bad places when it came to psychosis, and clearly that's still true, but it's now obvious, or it seems obvious, that there are other factors that are associated with cities. Or put it this way, if you decompose all the features of cities, then you begin to guess that putting those features together in different combinations is going to yield different results. So the original picture that the bigger the city, the bigger the risk, kind of divided through all of these risk factors, and we got this nice coherent picture. But as we get more refined data from different places and larger data sets from individual places, we see that probably what we're going to have to do is look at a much more refined combination of the factors associated with cities in order to get the picture clear. Now, let me end with a transition to what Daniel is going to talk about. So far, I've told you what we know about cities and psychosis, but I haven't given you the slightest idea about why it would be that cities, or even some of the risk factors I just mentioned, why those would be particularly associated with increasing your risk of psychosis. Now, in the literature, there really is only one dominant hypothesis. It's really too general to be a hypothesis, which is really the point of what Daniel's going to say. But it is a kind of thesis or general approach to the problem, and it's called the social defeat hypothesis. It was first proposed in 2005, and without going into too much detail, let me give you a general idea of what the hypothesis is. Social defeat is an idea that comes from the study of animal aggression, and particularly the study of aggression in rodents. So if you take a mouse and you put it in the cage of a strange mouse, then the mice will fight. And one of them will win and one will be defeated. And the mouse that's defeated exhibits sort of quite characteristic behavior. And that behavior is associated with a whole stream of, a whole collection of downstream changes in hormones, in neurophysiology, and so on and so forth. One of those changes has to do with a part of the brain, a bit of brain circuitry, called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, which is a collection of brain regions that seem to be responsive to certain kinds of stress. And one of the things that happens when the HPA axis is activated is it generates cortisol, which is a hormone, probably not quite correctly thought of as the stress hormone. And cortisol affects dopamine function. And as I said, although the dopamine hypothesis is not true, dopamine probably is in some way related to psychosis. And so we get from social defeat to psychosis via this neurophysiological pathway. And so the hypothesis then is there's something about city living that generates more or more severe experiences of the human equivalent, whatever that might be, of social defeat. And via this elaborate neurophysiological pathway, one's risk of psychosis increases. And now what I'm going to do is hand it off to Daniel, who will talk a little bit about what this might in fact amount to in the context of real humans in real cities.
So before you do that, Ian, let me introduce Daniel. If that's okay. So thanks, Ian. So that's a great demonstration about how much there is sort of going on, right? So there have been all these major sort of biological findings, and whether it's the dopamine hypotheses, some of the data you showed by the Lederbogen study, but it's also very clear that there are a range of social factors that are at play here in the risk, onset, and course of psychotic illness. The classic example of which is cities, and yet we're still not quite sure what it is about cities. So to the extent that cities are associated with the onset of psychosis, there may be something about cities, either physically, socially, but cities may be a proxy for other underlying causative factors. So that's a beautiful way to end. And I think Daniel is going to speculate a little bit, or even suggest kind of a research agenda that might help us move some of these investigations forward. So Daniel he's the Katharine A. Pearson Chair in Civil Society and Public Policy, was the founding director of IHSP, I believe, and has made that really a wonderful host for some of the conversations that we've been having about cities and psychosis and cities and mental health over the last few years, since I joined McGill in 2013, certainly, and maybe even before. Daniel, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, thank you. So not the founding director, but the director for the last 7 years until Ari took over. So I'm going to do something that those of you who know me know that I don't do very much, which is I'm going to share some slides. So hopefully this will work. Can everybody see my slides? It's a miracle. Okay, so I first heard about these results, fascinating results from Ian, a number of years ago, and I think as Ian mentioned, the social defeat hypothesis is both a very compelling one, but it's also a very kind of coarse-grained one. What are the phenomena that we should be looking at in cities that kind of count as social defeat? We're obviously not like those, were they rats, Ian? We're obviously not like those rats sort of literally, or, it isn't the case that we're habitually sort of engaging in the kind of activity that that the rats are engaging in. So what is it that we should be looking at to try to substantiate the claim that there's something on the order of social defeat that is going on that accounts for the higher prevalence of psychosis in cities, that we could somehow look at with a slightly more fine-grained set of tools. And so, I've been thinking about this literally for years, and I had my first aha moment, or eureka moment, or whatever you want to call it, a couple of years ago when I heard a lecture by a philosophy professor, actually, at University of Connecticut at Storrs by the name of Lewis Gordon, who has been responsible for getting a lot of that gentleman's work sort of retranslated and edited. So that gentleman is Frantz Fanon, who, as most of you probably know, was a French psychiatrist from Martinique, who worked for a number of years, crucial years that were right in the heart of the revolution in Algeria. And he published a couple of books, one of which I remember reading as an undergraduate, and made a huge impression. And it took Lewis Gordon's lecture for me to make the connection between it and what we were working on. A couple of very famous books called The Wretched of the Earth and Black Skin, White Mask. And in the last few years, his notes as a psychiatrist have been edited and have been published in French, and Lewis is busily getting them translated and edited for an English version. So what was Fanon? Fanon was a fascinating figure and a fascinating intellectual who wrote plays, but the idea that, you know, sort of created this aha moment or eureka moment is well expressed by the quote that's on the slide. Imperialism leaves behind germs of rot, which we must clinically detect and remove from our land, but from our minds as well. So the basic idea that Fanon sort of made central to his psychiatric activity is that colonialism and the injustices of colonialism imprint themselves on the body of victims of colonialism, to be sure. And, you know, he was a chronicler both of the effects of torture, which was a routine tool of colonial domination in Algeria, the effect of torture both on the mind of the victims of torture, but interestingly also on the perpetrators. So it imprints itself on the body, but it also imprints itself on the mind. And I think some of the most sort of important ideas of Fanon have to do with the way in which our minds help us adapt to, in ways which might seem from the outside to be sort of dysfunctional, to the reality of intense injustice, such as colonialism instantiates. And some of the phenomena are well known and have been studied. One of them is a sort of adaptive behavior, adaptive preference behavior, where you internalize the image of yourself that your colonial master projects upon you. And to some degree, that was the theme of Black Skin, White Mask. But the other might be, you know, that it gives rise to a kind of psychotic behavior where the organism, as it were, throws up, you know, distances itself, disassociates itself from what is happening to it in order to survive, as it were, which, you know, is in line with the way in which Ian has described psychosis. So obviously that was, Fanon's writing was in the context of one of the most brutal colonial experiences of the 20th century, which was Algeria. You know, the cities that we're talking about now are not ones in which this form of colonial oppression is instantiated, at least not obviously. So what could the equivalent of the sort of thing that Fanon was talking about be in the context of the types of cities where there seems to be this correlation between city life and psychosis? And the idea that I think we should be exploring is this. The idea of microaggression. So microaggression is a term that is, you know, sort of well known in popular parlance, to the point where it has become, to some degree, a victim of its own success in the parlance, and has been sort of critiqued in, you know, to some degree by people who are unsympathetic to the idea as being, you know, just anything. Anytime that someone looks askance at another person, it's an instance of microaggression, and to the extent that it can be everywhere, it's really nowhere and is kind of meaningless. The concept has been subjected to kind of conceptual inflation, which has reduced its value. So one of the interesting things about, and I just put up a couple of the papers that are sort of philosophy papers that have tried to sort of hone in on a more sort of disciplined conception of microaggression, have led me to the conclusion is something like the following. So there is a range of phenomena which have basically sort of the following contours. There are ways in which we interact. So let me start by, there are ways in which we interact, which for the victims of microaggression reinforce what I call, in the work that I've been starting to do on microaggression, scripts. What I mean by scripts are essentially ways in which we relate to other people in a hierarchical manner, right? Which reinforce and are reinforced by structures of domination or social oppression. So think about, you know, to observe this in yourself, in your everyday life. As we go through our everyday life, you know, very few of us act exactly the same way to all the people that we encounter. We probably change our way of modulating our voice or our way we move our bodies, depending on whether talking to children, to adults, maybe some of us who are older still have a kind of a gendered set of scripts, and which make it the case that we'll relate differently to men and to women. There are all sorts of ways in which we inflect our voices, our ways of acting, our behavior, our gestures, depending on who we're talking to. A lot of this is kind of innocuous, it's noise, it's not of any particular interest to what we're talking about now, but there's a range of phenomena which basically are sort of within that large set, which are toxic, because essentially what they do is they encode in ways that are often extremely subtle, ways in which schemes of oppression that are sometimes institutionalized sort of take form in everyday interactions, in gestures that are often below the radar of explicit consciousness, but nonetheless operative and affecting the people who are at the receiving end of them. So the paper on the left, Microaggression, Conceptual and Scientific Issues, starts with a kind of a scenario which is extremely sort of banal and everyday, of a young woman who enters a grocery store. The clerk, the person at the cash is African American. And the person sort of hands the cash, the change to her. This is all sort of pre-COVID, where we still sort of handed things to one another in bodily form. Hands the change to her, and the woman sort of expresses surprise because what she expects is for the change to be deposited in a manner that doesn't require that they come into physical contact. So the example is kind of modulated by the author. One of the people who does this is an American who is very much aware of the history of sort of racial oppression that separated white people and black people in the United States. And the other one is a tourist who does exactly the same thing, has the same kind of reaction, but obviously without the intention of encoding a discriminatory behavior, since she's completely from the outside. And the sort of puzzle is, the person who is at the receiving end of this kind of behavior of distancing receives them, feels them as being sort of microaggressions in the same way. And there's a bit of a puzzle that philosophers like playing with. And the basic idea is that what is really doing the work is not just the action itself, which in and of itself is kind of trivial, but the fact that it reinforces a structure of interaction, which is oppressive and which sort of refers back to a structure of institutionalized discrimination. And the sort of insidious and perverse thing about microaggression is it can still continue to be present long after the institutional manifestations of it have been sort of changed and modified through institutional reform. So the basic idea is that if we want a concept that kind of brings down to something operationalizable and measurable and something that is the sort of human city equivalent of what was happening between those rats in the cage of Ian's last slide, microaggression might be an interesting place to start, because it does have the sort of feature for those people who are on the receiving end of it of being a kind of a constant pressure that is exercised upon the organism by reminders that in big cities are obviously going to be more frequent of sort of patterns of interaction that are hurtful, that are painful, that betoken a kind of injustice. And I'm just putting up a number of sort of other papers that are out there in the literature that have tried to operationalize the concept of microaggression. And the two things that are kind of promising is that microaggression is, when people are asked, when do you encounter microaggression? It seems to be exactly in the kind of context that one would expect from Ian's story, and even from Ian's the refinements of the story that Ian gave towards the latter part of his presentation. First world cities rather than cities of the developing world. What is the case in first world cities? They are cities of immigration. And they are cities in which immigration very often, not always, but very often, brings into contact with one another people who are stratified, by ethnocultural identity. And so, you know, what the data suggests is that microaggression is perceived precisely in the kinds of urban contexts that you would expect. That is, in contexts in which, A, there's a lot of diversity, where that diversity isn't just horizontal, but vertical, as it were, stratified, where it betokens inequality. Sorry, the people next door have decided that a pandemic is the ideal time in which to do redo their foundation. So here you have it, the vagaries of teaching during or lecturing during COVID. And also that people experience it, and this is the kicker, so that middle sort of slide is a short paper by a woman who shows that people tend to experience it more when they are in parts of the city where they stand out, right? So this is about sort of Latin millennials who, so there are these stories of people who go for a special occasion to a part of the city that they are economically usually not disposed to be in for a sort of celebration. They're surrounded by a lot of sort of richer white people and experience microaggression that they don't feel in their own sort of neighborhood, where they are more in a kind of an ethnic enclave. And there's also some evidence, the paper on the left, that this is actually impacting on people's mental health. It's not just that people experience it as something unpleasant, it's actually that we can sort of correlate it with negative mental health outcomes. The last slide, this is a political theorist who died tragically young by the name of Iris Marion Young, who wrote a book, her last book before she died, called Inclusion and Democracy, where she makes the following point. She says, you know, when injustice, when inequality is the cause of people self-segregating in cities, choosing to especially instantiate residential patterns that are sort of ghettoizing, quote unquote, well, that's a bad thing. But when people choose it of their own accord without being pushed to it by economic injustices, it's something that we ought to sort of pause before we criticize, because, as it were, people know what's good for them. When people choose to be surrounded by the kinds of people that are like them, it could be because, you know, that way they'll know where to get the right kinds of foods, etc. But it could also be because, without it having been fully theorized, they recognize the degree to which enclaving with people like them can immunize them, can shelter them from the kinds of pressures that they would otherwise be completely without defense from when they are sort of isolated or small sort of groups within larger sort of contexts made up of members of the majority, contexts in which they are more likely to suffer the kinds of under the radar, subtle, but nonetheless identifiable microaggressions that I talked about earlier. So that's, so what is all this, stop share. So what is the point of all of this? The point of all of this is that, you know, I think the concept of microaggression, duly sort of disciplined in the way that I suggested, provides us with a kind of a more, you know, we go from the kind of sort of slightly elephant sort of paw concept of just, you know, social defeat to something that, you know, is actually identifiable in people's lives. And as far as the little bit of research, empirical research that, you know, I've found on the concept, actually seems to occur in exactly the places that we would predict that it does. In big cities where the risk of sort of constant microaggression is very high, and especially in cities that are very stratified, in cities that tend to be magnets for immigration, where people who arrive are viewed with the kinds of attitudes that underpin and have been victims of institutions that are often sort of expressive of injustice. So the tagline, which I've been using sort of in talking about this, is, you know, that in a sense, the research agenda, the hypothesis that we're following, is that psychosis is one of the organism's reaction to the perception of injustice. And I think that microaggression gives us a hook with which to sort of explore that in an empirically more useful way. So I'll stop there. And
Hello.
hand it back to Jay.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks, Ian, as well. So that was a very nice sort of way to pick up the strands that Ian had laid out and start weaving them together. We can maybe, I don't see a lot of questions, but if folks know how to type questions into the chat box, and if those come, then I can read them out, and then Ian or Daniel or both can begin to respond to them. Maybe while we are waiting for some of the questions to keep coming in, I will start. So I've been primed to make sure I had a couple of questions on hand. So Daniel, maybe we can start with some of, the comment you made at the end there about sort of psychosis being the organism's reaction, right? And the subtext of it was that it was in some ways an understandable reaction to injustice. To me, I mean, certainly, it was eloquent and lucid. It also reminded me of some threads from the anti-psychiatry movement, actually, in which it was often said that mental illness is kind of a reaction to an unjust world, and that that critique was used to make the point that in fact the problem was not the individual, but the problem was sort of their surroundings. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on sort of maybe some of the similarities and perhaps some of the differences between that previous argument or thread and the new one.
So again, here I'm treading on territory which I'm not at all expert on, but I think I'd say the following thing. So essentially, one of the ways in which to sort of describe this agenda is in terms of what is, I think, the bright red thread that unites a lot of the research that gets done across a wide range of areas at the Institute for Health and Social Policy, right? Which is to explore the social determinants of health. Now, a lot of that is about social determinants of physical health, but a lot of the research is also, I think, the research by Frank Elgar on the social determinants of mental health. Now, I think, to the degree that I know anything about the anti-psychiatry movement, I think maybe the problematic inference, the inference that should be interrogated, is that, as it were, it'll be a long time, right? It gives us something to, I think it gives us a target for reform, right? Rather than addressing health issues downstream at their manifestation point, we should also be addressing their causes in order for policy to address these health problems in a more durable kind of way. The problematic inference is to say that the people who are suffering from health problems can wait that long, right? I mean, in a way, the problems that they have are fully realized within their organisms and need to be addressed. And I think that there's a category mistake to say, well, we're not going to treat you with the tools of, and it's actually a reaction that Fanon himself did not have, right? He was a psychiatrist after all, right? We're not going to treat you because, with the clinical sort of resources that we have, because the root cause of your problem is deeper down. Well, for the people who are presently suffering, changing those deeper down sort of structural causes, is just not going to help them. So I think we have to have a chewing gum and walking at the same time kind of approach, recognizing the deep causes, but also having tools with which to address them for the people for whom those root causes have, as it were, realized themselves.
Thanks, Daniel. Ian, I'm curious if you wanted to either pick up on some of what Daniel said there, or the question that I posed.
I'll just say a word. I mean, like Daniel, I'm not much of an expert on the period, but my sense of the anti-psychiatry movement is that it was very much part of the sort of liberation movements of the 60s that really were addressed at the dysfunction of society, or the changing conception of society, and didn't have all that much to do with actual evidence about the relationship between psychiatry and mental health. I think what's interesting about the sort of stuff we're talking about is that there's lots of nice hard data suggesting that there really is something going on here, and the question is what?
Yeah, indeed, and that's some of the data both of you presented. So we're getting some questions rolling in here, and some comments. I think Tom, and I think I know which Tom this is, made a comment about racism and sexism and prejudice, micro and macroaggressions in not just early psychosis, like the early phases of psychosis, but indeed the at-risk period for psychosis, which is certainly true, and that's some of the work that's happening internationally. Vidya Iyer made a comment about there's some work in India that people from scheduled castes and tribes are about 3 times more likely to be depressed. Unfortunately, we don't have psychosis data, but the notion of sort of thinking about this across caste categories might well be, if that data existed, that would help to substantiate or insubstantiate some of the theories that have been posed. Ian, Daniel, I wonder if you wanted to comment on either of those as an exemplar of how you could go about studying some of this.
So I'll just say one thing. I mean, one of the things that would be really interesting is to mine the data that we already have, right? To see, so cities are big, even big city. Just even if we limit ourselves to sort of big cities, are unbelievably diverse along so many dimensions in terms of their homogeneity, heterogeneity, in terms of the range of economic inequalities, in terms of the ways in which those economic inequalities do or don't map out onto ethnocultural differences, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, where the data exists, it really be interesting to see whether differences sort of map out onto the hypotheses that we're talking about. So I'd be very curious. So the person who I'm looking at the chat box. So there's data about depression, but not about psychosis. It'd be very interesting to see whether in a place, whether in cities like India that have this sort of deeply institutionalized, which I imagine is manifested in all kinds of ways by daily sort of interactions of a microaggressive kind, whether those cities might be exceptions to the what seems to be the rule that Ian pointed out of cities in the global south being somewhat immune from this phenomenon. So I think that we have to go see what data there is, and to see whether the differences map out onto the hypotheses that we're laying out.
Ian, did you want to pick up on any
of
that?
No.
Okay.
That's great.
Okay. Thanks. So we have a couple of points. Actually, they look both to be questions. One by Ebele, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, and the other by Arjit, talking about sort of different patterns of psychosis in cities in emerging economies versus Western countries, and the other being about race, ethnicity, immigration status. So does the evidence from those settings support the theory about microaggressions as a potential mediator? Ian, I wonder if you wanted to pick up, like, we can talk a little bit about ethnic density as an example, right? That might touch on some of this.
Right. So I think one of the difficulties in doing this kind of work is practical, which is it's very expensive and laborious to collect this kind of data. And one of the worries that Daniel and the rest of our group, including Jay, in fact, have talked about is how reliable are the data coming from different places, and if they are reliable, are they comparable? So, for example, is it possible that the way India calculates or determines what counts as a big city is exactly the same as the way Nigeria does, same in Canada? So there's a certain amount of work that has to be done before we can even begin to look at these data. And I think that the diversity or the complexity that's emerging from the new studies are actually making the work much more interesting. Because if it were the case that big cities was all that mattered, then we just have to find the secret sauce of the big city and we'd know what's what. Obviously, it's much more complicated and we need a more refined story. So ethnicity is definitely going to be part of the story so far as we can tell. Immigrants who come to cities not only have an increased risk of psychosis in virtue of being immigrants, but living in a big city as an immigrant raises your risk even further. We know, for example, that immigrants who live in ethnic enclaves with people from their home country are actually relatively spared of the risk of psychosis. I mean, the risk is still higher, but not as high as an immigrant who lives in a multicultural neighborhood. So you get a bit of a paradoxical effect here. Countries like Canada like to try to integrate immigrants into the larger culture, but there may be some reason for, or some justification for ethnic enclaves. It's also the case that even native-born individuals who have, who are in terms of their appearance, part of an ethnic minority, they're also more vulnerable. So clearly, there is the kind of thing that Daniel's pointing to makes extremely good sense in the context of ethnic diversity and immigration, because people who are different in appearance are obviously going to be particularly vulnerable to all sorts of aggression.
One of the things, I see a question here, I don't know whether I'm allowed to jump in and sort of pick through the questions from my old friend Martin Blanchard, who I virtually waved to, about basically one of the issues that I'm really interested in as someone whose political sort of awakening came in the 70s and early 80s, when you could still talk about this with a straight face, is class, right? Socioeconomic class. So Martin raises the question of people from different socioeconomic classes reacting in different ways to issues that they face in housing with landlords, whereas people from a sort of higher class will react to it with outrage and, I've got to do something about this. There's a resignation that comes from people who are, and this is sort of independent, I take it, Martin, of sort of ethnocultural, right? Even in a place that's fairly ethnoculturally homogenous, it'd be interesting to see whether in the context of an economic system that creates winners and losers in a fairly intense way, whether class could be a predictor. So you say at the end of your comment, I have to add that there's an increase in persons with mental health problems contacting us. It'd be interesting to see whether, and there's no question that, you can tell a whole story about microaggression. Class is visible, right? Class is visible in the way people talk, in the way people dress, in the way people comport themselves. And so it is, likely that it will be kind of like something that will tend to give rise to the microaggressions that I'm talking about. It'd be interesting to see whether it's also a predictor of, whether societies that are ethnoculturally not that diverse but quite economically stratified will be cities that have a high correlation or not. There's Martin. Salut Martin.
So Daniel, that's the kind of either sort of natural experiment or observational data that would help us tease apart sort of which of these, city status is a proxy for underlying risk factors or protective factors for that matter. These are the kinds of studies that would allow us to tease apart which factors are acting in which combinations, in which settings.
That's right.
Vidya made sort of another point, which is kind of translating that to clinical settings or services, right? So we've had, Vidya says years, we've had decades of research, in fact, on social determinants, their role in psychosis, their role in mental health in general, yet little gets integrated into the care provided to individuals or the orientation, the structure, the functioning of services. Are there ways,
in a way that's
based on what we know? Sorry?
That's a question for you, Jay.
It absolutely is. I mean, as a service provider and a service organizer, I mean, it's something that I think the field in early psychosis certainly has had a tough time grappling with, right? The mainstay of service organization seems to be get people in quickly and then treat them with generally the biomedical model. to the extent that there have been pushbacks against that, it's been relatively limited. There are some, Vidya, I'm thinking about places like open dialogue and some of these other treatment-based paradigms, which are a little bit different in orientation. There are roots that are sort of emerging, or shoots emerging in different places, but none of them have had widespread traction. There could be a whole conversation, I think, about kind of the forces at play here, right? In allowing non-biomedical or more sort of synthetic integrative approaches to really take root in clinical services. Ian, Daniel, any further thoughts?
I'll just say one thing about this.
Thrown a few balls in the air. I was just saying, I hope I've
go ahead.
Say one quick thing, which is it's a very interesting point, Vidya, because of course, even in the context of psychosis, where we're thinking biomedically, I assume that most psychiatrists are going to be quite interested, say, in a history of sexual abuse in their patients or other sorts of trauma, which is, after all, a social determinant of all sorts of mental disorders. And so it is puzzling. I agree with you that it wouldn't occur as a matter of general interest to, or maybe it would in some cases, to ask patients about their experience as an ethnic minority. I've certainly encountered people who have said to me, I really would like to find a psychotherapist who comes from Iran, where I'm from, or I'd like to find a psychotherapist who's a second generation Iranian, because there's a kind of unique perspective that this community has, and I really don't feel like anyone could appreciate the cultural subtleties. And I think that's the kind of thing, if only we had the resources, which could address some of your question, Vidya.
So Ian, some of it's about resources, some of it's about time and in general orientation as well, right? So,
yeah.
So it's not always valued. It's not always sort of, integrated into guidelines, for example, about the key components of services.
Right.
And I'm thinking back to a couple of cases I've had recently in which actually microaggressions were the heart of the presentation, and we had to actually spend some time unpacking that. But that's not something that's certainly valued in mainstream psychiatric or mental health practice, even now. Okay, we're unfortunately running out of time. Jennifer, did you want to sort of take it away from me, take the gavel away?
Sure. I just want to thank Daniel and Ian for a fantastic talk, and it's great to have so many people and such great questions. I just wanted to let you know, as you may all know, we're having at least this fall, our series of talks is every 2 weeks on Tuesdays at the same time, and our next talk is October 20th. Will be led by Claudia Mitchell, who's an associate member of the HSP and director of we're co-hosting the talk with the Institute for Human Development and Wellbeing here at McGill. And it's going to be a very exciting, different talk. It's not called Girl in the Pandemic, the lives of girls and young women in the time of COVID-19. And there'll be speakers from South Africa, Ethiopia, and Quebec, sharing some of the challenges, the health challenges and increases to gender equality considerations are challenges with COVID-19. And in hearing from developing strategies with young women and girls to address some of these challenges. So that's our upcoming talk, and we have a whole series every second Tuesday after that as well.
If I could say one last thing, I think that it's a good idea to keep these webinars to 1 hour. I think there are limits to what we can do on Zoom. I can see in the chat that there are a lot of people who have, after that initial moment of shyness, had a lot of really interesting things to say. Please don't hesitate. This should be the beginning rather than the end of a conversation. So please don't hesitate to reach out to Ian, to myself, to both, in order to share your ideas, because this is the sort of beginning rather than the end of a research project. So I'd love to hear from all of you. Thank you very much for making the time to be here.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ian.